All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking into something I bet you've run into a ton of times without even realizing it. Brand nicknames.
Yeah.
Like when you hear Tarjay instead of Target, or Big Blue when someone's talking about IBM.
Mhm.
We've got a whole stack of research here that really digs into why these kind of informal names pop up, and we'll be getting into the surprising ways they can affect brands, and even what happens when companies try to come up with their own nicknames, get in on the action themselves.
Right.
So the goal here is to give you a much clearer understanding of this, I think pretty interesting side of branding.
Absolutely. I mean, we're basically talking about all these consumer created shortcuts,
Uh,
for these really formal brand names.
yeah.
So instead of Chevrolet, you get Chevy. Instead of McDonald's, it's Mickey D's. And the big thing here is these nicknames, they don't come from some marketing team,
Right, right.
They come directly from the public.
Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit. Why do these nicknames exist in the first place? I mean, from looking at the research we've got, it seems like there are a few key reasons, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it's way easier to say,
Right.
like Chevy, it's just quicker. Other times the nickname just sounds really similar to the formal name, so it kind of morphs into that naturally.
Makes sense.
And often it seems like these nicknames carry this feeling of friendliness, it's like you're on a first name basis with the brand.
Absolutely. Like there's this familiarity built in.
Exactly. And what I think is super interesting is that we're seeing more and more companies actually experimenting with what they're calling nickname branding, where they're trying to use these informal names themselves.
Yeah, it's a really interesting trend. And it's funny because the early research we looked at, it kind of hinted that when consumers use nicknames, it could strengthen their connection to the brand, right?
Yeah.
But some of the more recent studies that we've been looking at, they suggest that when companies try to force it or adopt these nicknames themselves, which we might want to call brand-initiated nicknames, just to keep it clear.
Sure.
They suggest that can actually backfire and have a negative impact.
Wow. Okay. So there's this tension there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
A real push and pull.
Yeah. So why don't we start with the positives? Like when consumers are the ones who create these nicknames and use them organically, what really jumps out at you from the research?
Well, I think the big one is memorability.
Mm-hmm.
Nicknames are often shorter, they're more informal, and that makes them much, much easier to recall.
Right.
Like think about Tarjay, right?
Yeah.
Just catchy. It's got that rhythm.
It's fun to say.
It's fun to say.
Mm.
And that shorter, often rhythmically pleasing kind of nature of nicknames, it taps into this thing called cognitive fluency.
Oh.
Basically, it's just the idea that our brains process these things more easily, and that makes them stickier.
Interesting.
So it's all connected to what makes a good brand name in the first place.
Yeah.
Distinctive, relevant, memorable.
That makes total sense. I mean, it's simpler to say, it's easier to remember, and it seems like these nicknames also make the brands themselves feel more approachable, almost like you're talking about a friend. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it can make a huge company feel way more human.
Yeah.
More relatable.
Right.
And it signals a closeness that goes way beyond just a simple transaction. It suggests that consumers have this real personal connection with the brand. It's almost like when you give a formal person, someone you like, a casual nickname, right? It signifies a closer, more personal bond.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And that connection that seems to actually foster loyalty, right? Because our sources talk about how consumer use of these nicknames, it strengthens that emotional bond.
Oh, absolutely. It increases what researchers call cognitive closeness.
Yeah.
And you can think of that as just how mentally and emotionally connected you feel to a brand.
Gotcha.
So a nickname can really boost this feeling of being in the know, or part of an inner circle.
Mm-hmm.
It increases brand prominence. So basically how easily the brand comes to mind when you're thinking about that product category. And that can definitely lead to repeat business. And sometimes people even they prefer the nickname and they use it more than the formal name.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. Okay, so we've talked about the upside when all of this happens naturally, but what happens when brands try to get in on the action themselves? What are some of the potential downsides there?
Well, one of the big ones is the risk of brand dilution. When brands try to force this nickname branding, if it feels forced or inauthentic, or if the nickname gets used in a negative context, then it can actually weaken all those positive associations. It can damage the brand's perceived value and even the price they can command for their products.
So they risk losing control of how their brand is seen, basically.
Exactly. Once a nickname takes off, especially if it wasn't their idea in the first place, the company loses a lot of control over the perceptions and the associations that come with it. And that can be a big problem if the nickname starts being used in ways that they don't want.
Right. So we've got some examples here of nicknames that really took off organically, like Chevy, Big Blue, Target, Mickey D's. What makes those work so well?
Well, I think a key thing in all these success stories is that they arose organically. They
Mhm.
weren't forced. Often it was because they were just phonetically easier to say, or they connected to some real characteristic of the brand. And most importantly, they showed genuine affection from the consumers.
Right. So on the flip side, we've got some examples where brands tried to make this happen themselves, and it didn't really work out. Like Bloomingdale's, they tried Bloomies.
Yeah.
Target had that Target campaign.
Yeah.
Even Radio Shack tried calling themselves the Shack for a while. Why did those fall flat?
Well, it raises this important question of authenticity because often these brand-initiated nicknames, they feel forced or like the company's trying way too hard to be cool or hip, like, take the Shack
Hmm.
for Radio Shack. It felt like a pretty desperate attempt to try and sound cool and modern, but it really missed the mark with their core customer base. It even felt a little dismissive of their established brand image,
Oh, yeah.
And then in some cases, like Cadillac using Caddy, it can even diminish the brand's perceived status.
Huh.
It comes off as inauthentic, and it can
Mm.
suggest that they lacked confidence in the original brand name.
So it really boils down to who's using the nickname and why, right?
Precisely. And what we're seeing in the research is that formal brand names, they actually perform better in traditional advertising and even brand-created social media content.
Hmm.
So this whole nickname branding thing, it can actually hurt overall performance in those areas. Whereas nicknames, they thrive in user-generated content because they just feel more authentic. But when it's coming directly from the company, it can seem really out of place.
Yeah.
So brands really need to be careful about using nicknames in their own marketing.
And social media, it seems like it just amplifies this whole phenomenon, right?
Right.
Makes these nicknames spread like wildfire.
Yeah, the speed is incredible. Social media just accelerates the creation and the spread of these nicknames so much faster than we've ever seen before. And what's really interesting is that consumer posts that are using nickname hashtags, they often see higher engagement. And then online communities, they really solidify these nicknames as like these social signals, so that inferred brand attachment, the idea that when you see other consumers using a nickname, you might automatically assume they have a positive connection. And that influences your own view that's much stronger in these organic online spaces. So brands should definitely monitor these trends, but they should generally avoid directly adopting nicknames in their own social media.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's also interesting how the type of brand seems to matter here. It seems like nickname branding, it's more damaging for what they call competent brands, like technology companies or luxury brands than it is for warm brands, like charities or something.
That's a really critical point. Luxury brands in particular, they risk eroding their prestige by using these informal nicknames. And of course, audience demographics play a role here too. Different age groups might have varying levels of acceptance for nicknames.
Right. And legally, can brands actually trademark a nickname? Like could Target actually trademark Tarjay?
They can, if the nickname meets the standard criteria for a trademark, which is that it needs to be distinctive. So think of distinctive as like clearly identifiable with their brand.
Okay.
But it's often a smart defensive move for brands to consider trademarking these popular nicknames and securing related website domains because the same legal principles apply to nicknames as to formal brand names.
Gotcha. Okay, so the big takeaway here for everyone listening is that these consumer generated brand and nicknames, they're really powerful indicators of connection and familiarity, but the strength of these nicknames really lies in their natural origin, So when brands try to force it, it often backfires.
Exactly. I think the best advice is to just pay attention to to the informal language that people use around the brands that you interact with. Notice which nicknames stick and really think about why, because it gives you a real glimpse into how consumers truly feel.
And and here's a final thought to chew on. What happens when a brand actively tries to discourage a popular nickname? Does that make it even more popular, or does it eventually fade away?
Yeah.
It's a really delicate dance between brand control and consumer culture, so definitely something to think about.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.